What we have here is really quite an astonishing thing. Non-whites and lefties accuse whites of thinking something that they don't think and that they deny thinking, but that they should think. It's really an extraordinary thing. Well, why don't white people think the way they ought to think? Why is it, basically, that white people have gone insane? I've been wondering about this for more than 20 years, probably going on 30 years now, and I've probably heard every explanation that floats around out there. There are people who say that the moral devastation of 2 horrible world wars did it. There are people who say that the machinations of the Jews did it. There are people who say that Christianity makes whites uniquely susceptible to dispossession. I'm not really satisfied with any of those explanations. I think there's something about the essential nature of white people that makes us easy prey, and it makes it easy for others to induce us to work for their interests and against our own. Part of it really is individuality. In the West, we celebrate the ego, the lone wolf, the rugged individualist, the self-made man. Our heroes, they're all individuals. And we celebrate individuality to the point where it's difficult for us to think in terms of the larger group, in terms of the race. At the same time, there's something else I'd like to elaborate on. Think for a moment about what characterizes the West and our societies. What are our distinctive institutional hallmarks? There's such things as representative government, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, rule of law. The West is also unique in having a chivalric tradition that honors women. We're also unique in the extent of our tradition of public charity. And what do all these things have in common? They reflect what I would call a kind of moral imagination. They reflect an ability to think in terms of the aspirations and the sufferings of others. Take freedom of speech. It's based really on the remarkable idea that I should allow you to say absolutely anything you want, even if I'm convinced you are dead wrong, and even if what you say badly hurts my interests. And representative government works the same way. It means that even if I have power, if the other fellow gets more votes, if he persuades the other people to vote for him, then I move out of office. Whites recognize that the other fellow has a point of view. Free speech means the other fellow gets to have his say. Elections mean the other people have an opportunity to rule. And the rule of law means that it makes no difference whether you're rich or poor or powerful or weak. You're supposed to get the same treatment in court. At least, that's the ideal. And by and large, white societies operate according to these rules. And by and large, it's only white societies that operate this way. We've gone even further, though. It's not just the other fellow who has a point of view and gets his say. The other sex does too. The status of women, the status of the physically weaker sex, is higher in the West than anywhere. I remember a Japanese lady once telling me that the traditional view of women in Japan was that they had a status somewhere between that of a man and that of a bird. The idea also of limiting the most powerful men to just one wife, that too raises the status of women, and it also gives other men the chance to find a mate. And just as the other sex has a point of view, so do other species. I believe we are uniquely concerned about the snail darter and the spotted owl, and we pass laws to protect the habitat of species nobody's ever heard of. Who here has heard of the Kreshmer cave mold beetle or the pygmy mad tom? Well, we are busily protecting their habitat. Did you realize there are even endangered lichens that we're protecting? The rock gnome lichen must not be disturbed in its habitat. Do the Japanese want to save the whales? No, they want to eat the whales. Of course, I'm picking on the Japanese only because I know them very well, but I understand that Cantonese will tell you, in Canton, they will tell you the only thing with 4 legs that they don't eat is the table. Whites care about the environment, too. Why is that? I think it's because we're concerned about people who haven't even yet been born. We want to leave a pleasant planet for them. And I think that also explains why it's whites who are so concerned about the budget deficit. They realize the only legitimate way to pay off a budget deficit is to have real people paying real taxes. And they are aware of the burden that will be on future generations. Some of our other traditions, for example, good sportsmanship. The victor does not gloat. Well, we've had an awful hard time explaining that to blacks and Hispanics, haven't we? Yeah. Another tradition, of course, is public charity, doing good works for complete strangers. All of these are based on concern for others, on this kind of moral imagination that I mentioned. Well, Bill Clinton used to say, "I feel your pain," but that was just a vaudeville act. But I think whites are uniquely capable of, in some sense, feeling the pain of others. Now, this is a virtue. It's a virtue so long as it's practiced within the family, within the tribe, within the nation. But this consideration for others is now, I believe, a large part of our downfall, and for two reasons. First of all, this virtue has become overgrown to the point of perversion. We now have such a high regard for women that we think that they should be firemen, that they should serve in combat and work on nuclear submarines. We have such a high regard for the mentally retarded that we think it's just darling if they marry and have children. And we have such a high regard for the interests of other races that we're prepared to give them our countries. At the same time, of course, non-whites have learned how to take advantage of this weakness. Consider the case of hate crime hoaxes. Whenever they happen, the police chief or the college president or the mayor, they're baffled. They can't understand. Why would such a thing be done? It's a mystery. It's not a mystery at all. Non-whites have discovered that white people will just come swarming around and cuddle them and pet them and shed tears over them if they claim to have been mistreated by white racism. It's a month of Christmases for anybody who can make that claim. So if they can't find an obliging white man to mistreat them, they just stage the whole thing. And even when the hoax is found out, the city or the college has their candlelight vigil or their teach-in against white supremacy anyway. Because even if this particular case was a hoax, we must rise up in this moral paroxysm of indignation because of all the other acts of racism going on everywhere, all the time, all around the world. It's so easy to stir up white people. It's surprising to me that there are not more of these hoaxes. And third worlders who want to come live in our country, they've also discovered the same thing. They can make these appeals to human rights, Western concepts of human rights. They've discovered that there are plenty of people in charge of our borders who are insane like Arnie Duncan, who think that what they're doing is inspiring. And that's why, remember in 2005, there were 1 million Hispanics marching through the streets of Los Angeles, many of them self-affirmed illegal aliens demanding amnesty. Fancy that. Hundreds of thousands of criminals marching through the streets demanding amnesty for their crimes without the slightest fear that they would be arrested, rounded up, or deported. Well, Vilfredo Pareto once said that anyone who would become a wolf, now let me start over. Anyone who would become a lamb will find a wolf to eat him. Robert Frost said, a liberal is someone who can't take his own side in an argument. Well, a white person is someone who can't take his own side in any kind of racial argument. But it's this reigning white mentality that makes our work so difficult. What we're fighting against isn't an out-and-out vice. It's an overgrown, perverted virtue, after all. A man's devotion to his family is a virtue. And a man who is prepared to work for his country or his nation or his tribe, those are virtues. But sacrifice is certainly not always a virtue. It would not be a virtue for Ford to sacrifice itself for General Motors, or for France to sacrifice itself for Algeria. And it would certainly be perversion for one race to sacrifice itself for another. If white people are to survive, this is something they're going to have to understand. Whites, of course, have the power to ensure their own destiny, but they're paralyzed by this perversion of virtue that turns people who should be on our side against us. This is really the unspeakable frustration of what we do. It's our own people, the people that we love, who are most determined to stand against us and against themselves. And it is horrible beyond words to see our own people destroying themselves. If our race is going to survive, more people are going to have to think the way the people in this room think. This means that, like it or not, we're missionaries of a kind. We're in the business of saving souls, saving the souls of our wayward brethren. But the way to the soul is not necessarily through the mind. We have to arouse emotions. We have to appeal to better instincts and satisfy yearnings. And to do that, our facts have to be correct, and our logic has to be straight, but we also, I believe, have to be pure of heart. When we have purity of heart, that's greater than our facts. It's more important and more powerful than our logic. The Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, he said, purity of heart is to will one thing. When you will one thing with a pure heart, everything else follows. I believe that describes the work of every visionary, of every man and woman who is devoted to a great cause. For us, to will one thing would be act at all times in the interests of our family, of our nation, of our tribe, of our race. True purity of heart, of course, is achieved only by saints, but it is a goal and it can be our guide. The trouble, you see, is we're not overthrowing some kind of scientific paradigm. We're trying to overthrow what is, in effect, a moral paradigm. And when you're fighting the prevailing morality, it's not enough to be right. I think you have to be generous. It's not enough to be logical. You have to be virtuous. If you're defying moral orthodoxy, I believe that your demeanor will carry your message perhaps even further than your words will. Remember, people don't just disagree with us. Many of them genuinely think that we are evil. And when people think you're evil, I don't think they listen very carefully to your words. They search your manner. They look for the slightest excuse to ignore all your impregnable arguments, all your carefully marshaled facts. And that's why we must never be mean-spirited or angry or petulant or dismissive of the interests of others. I believe rudeness and arrogance that will drive people away, that will only confirm their own prejudices. It's the excuse they're desperate for to walk away smug and happy and say, these people are just small-minded, angry bigots. Our opponents don't recognize our good faith. But, and this is a hard thing, I think we must try our best to recognize their good faith. All right, there are a few that just want to kill us, but they don't count. I'm talking about the vast majority of our people who should be with us but who aren't. And yes, objectively speaking, they are supporting policies that will consign us to oblivion. But by their lights, they're good, upstanding people. They sincerely believe that they're on the side of the angels. And I think you will never understand them, you will never convince them of anything unless you understand that about them. You can't expect them to recognize our good intentions unless we are willing to recognize theirs. What we say may be factually irrefutable. It could be morally irreproachable, but that's not enough. It's not enough to be right. We have to be better. We have to be more thoughtful, more generous, more open, and more patient. And I realize that's hard, and it's unfair. But we are in a fight for our lives. We have more enemies than friends, and some of those enemies are going to have to become our friends if we're going to have a future. You all know that whites now face probably the worst crisis since their existence as a race. What threatens us with oblivion is ourselves, our own perverted values. I believe you're here in this room because you care passionately about the future of our race. And if our race is to have a future on this continent, it'll be due to the work of people in this room and people like you who, in your best moments, I believe, can will one thing. I know that many of you would be willing to die for your race. Well, if only it were that easy. If only we could just march laughing into Valhalla, having fought the decisive battle for our race and culture. Well, it doesn't work that way. What is required of all of us is something harder, really, than dying for your race. It's to live for your race. And it's to live in a way that draws people towards us and does not push them away. As men and women of the West, I believe our duty is clear. It's clear whether eventually we succeed or not. This isn't some kind of game in which we calculate the odds and then we place our bets accordingly. The odds don't affect our commitment, our cause. It's the great challenge of our age. It's the great responsibility of our generation. Win or lose, we're committed to this struggle, and we're committed gladly because we know that we're right. And in closing, I'd like to quote from one of those terrible fratricidal wars that we hope never to have again. Before the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson said to his men, "England expects every man to do his duty." Well, duty, ladies and gentlemen, is the message that's written on all of the great achievements of our civilization. And duty is the message that's written on the tombstones of your grandparents and great-grandparents. Duty is the message on your faces of your children, your sons and your daughters. And if we read that message and we act on it with a pure heart, we can assure our descendants of a future that is as worthy as their glorious past. Thank you very much.